There we go.
Hey.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Welcome, everyone. I'm Phoebe Jackson, a physics teacher at John Abbott and a Saltese Fellow, and I'm your moderator today. Today's webinar stems from a new arts-based para-academic project, the Creative for Collective Change. The project brings students, teachers, administrators, activists, artists, and curators all together to work towards developing opportunities for addressing complex social issues in creative, constructive, and critical ways. So before I even introduce our presenters today, I'm going to open with a land acknowledgement. And I know because this is an online meeting, we're not all on the same land. So you may wish to think about the land that you're currently on and add to it yourself. Dawson College is located on land which is the unceded traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. This land has also served as a gathering place for Abenaki, Anishinaabe, and other nations. As uninvited guests, it is our responsibility to honor the stewards of this land and waters by educating ourselves about the histories and the contemporary realities of First Peoples, and by contributing to the important work of reconciliation and decolonization. Today's webinar will be led by Kim Simard and Pat Romano from Dawson College. Kim is a teacher, filmmaker, and community activist who has presented and practiced around the world. Pat is a humanities teacher with an academic background in political science. There's quite a few other members from the Creative Collective for Change here as well to participate, including Florencia Vacheo, Anthony Bourgeois, Thea Castatero, Vanessa Copeland, Dipti Gupta, Susan Elmsley, and Natalie Gibb. And I'm sure you will be introduced to them as they come up on your screen. We recommend that to fully experience today's presentation, you set your view to speaker view. So you can really focus on who's ever presenting because it is going to change around a bit. So today's session is going to address some big questions, such as how can we create an inclusive classroom where all students feel safe and able to learn, while also engaging in dialogue with our students about potentially volatile social issues that touch us all. In some classrooms, these issues are part of the curriculum and are intentionally brought up by the teacher. But in other, the issues are brought up by our students, and sometimes it seems like they arise on their own, maybe bubbling up from the structure of our teaching methods, our course, or even our institutions. But regardless of how they get there, there's no escaping these issues in the classroom anymore. Yet the majority of us feel unprepared to engage with them. Some of us feel powerless, like we can't make a difference anyway, so why bother? Some of us perceive such conversations about social issues as belonging outside the classroom, not in our own discipline. Some of us are afraid that we aren't the right gender or the right race to have these conversations, like we don't have the credentials. We worry that we might say the wrong thing and cause more harm than good. We know that students might have a history of trauma, and we are afraid that something we say might act as a trigger. And most of us feel that we don't have the tools to properly engage in these dialogues. So Pat, Kim, and their team are going to work with us today to show us that we are not powerless, that having these conversations in our classroom is valuable, regardless of which subject we teach. They're going to provide us with tools for engaging in these conversations, offering a roadmap for moving forward that follows a resistance rather than a trauma-based approach to engaging in dialogue with our students on a range of potentially polarizing issues. And while they teach us all of this, they are also going to model it for us with their innovative presentation style. Through their intentionally unexpected webinar design, Pat, Kim, and their team are going to exemplify the way in which we present, they're going to exemplify how the way in which we present and discuss things affects the message that participants come away with. So this is not going to be your average webinar, so keep a close eye on the shape of what is about to follow. So with that, Pat and Kim and your team, it's over to you.
Thank you. So I think to begin, we'll just, why not start with a video? I teach in cinema communications, and Anthony was one of my students, and he's here to help with all the visuals that you're seeing today. And he also made this video. So we're going to start there. In the field of cancel culture or of academic freedom, but we are dedicated to finding ways to address complex issues in the classroom.
Okay, so I will start. In reconceptualizing complicity in the social justice classroom, Michelano Cimbalas argues that we need to stop treating complicity as a problem to be solved and start treating it as a fact of our civic life to learn to live with. He adds, if the issue is how to handle white students' denial of complicity, the pedagogical question at hand is not, what can I as a teacher do to reaffirm students' moral agency so they admit their complicity, but rather, how can I as a teacher move my students to take action in their everyday lives to refuse being complicit in social harm? Discussing society's many injustices is difficult in a classroom where some have been harmed, others perhaps have done some harming, and numerous others remain largely unaware or absolutely certain that any wrongs done in the world were not done by their people. The potential for triggering traumatic memories for some or provoking in others feelings of guilt, shame, resentment, anger, or a sense of superiority vis-a-vis those who don't get it is always present. Indeed, harmful power structures can both be reproduced and undermined in the classroom. And often, even when we have good intentions, perhaps it's not always so clear which one we are doing. For the educator who seeks to create spaces of constructive dialogue where interconnections are revealed and our agency and engagement activated, the challenge is huge.
Our starting point has been to think a lot more about denial and wonder whether, as Alison Loader, a 3D animation teacher in our community of practice, put it, we would become more effective pedagogues if we made a greater effort to better understand why some students resist us. To accept responsibility for the past is agonizing. We should never underestimate the lengths human subjects, governments, and nations will go to turn their back on a violent history and to silence disaster.
Silence, anger, disengagement, denial, each a common psychological process that can be activated automatically when we are faced with something that challenges our existing ideas and values. Cognitive dissonance. This happens to all of us at some time. We either hold two conflicting attitudes or we are confronted with our behavior contradicting our attitude. This situation creates extreme discomfort. Since discomfort is so unpleasant, all of us, are motivated to do anything to reduce it. We either change our behavior, change one of our cognitions, or add consonant cognitions. We will go to extreme lengths to reduce the discomfort, denial, distortion, and justification. So say Aronson et al. In 2022.
More modern research using functional magnetic resonance imagery technology has allowed researchers to locate what parts of the brain are activated when we are in a state of cognitive dissonance. The striatum and other highly specific areas within the prefrontal cortex are either activated or shut down. Basically, when we are in a situation of dissonance, the areas responsible for planning, reasoning, and decision-making are turned off, while the emotion circuit is shining bright when consonance is restored. Harmon Jones, 2010, Weston et al., 2006. So this means we cannot think rationally when we are in denial or trying to justify our attitudes and behaviors while facing dissonance.
In States of Denial, sociologist Stanley Cohen emphasizes the ordinariness of denial, arguing that the interesting question is not, why do we shut out, but why do we ever not shut out? Cohen explores the human tendency to deny more fully in describing some of the different forms denial can take. For example, in regards to what exactly is being denied. This could imply the facts themselves, as in, climate change isn't happening. The full significance of what happened, as in, it wasn't rape, or a dismissal or minimization of the psychological, political, or moral implications of what should follow, as in, that all happened in the past, let's just move on, or this is terrible, but what do you want me to do about it? The very persistence of denial reveals the difficulties of creating a classroom environment where students open up to new ideas, particularly when they connect to systems of privilege and disadvantage. In such a case, how productive is it to tell them they are wrong by repeating one more time the facts?
Stop me, oh, 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 stop me. Stop me if you think that you've heard this one before.
A teacher wants to bring up a social issue that has a multitude of complexities, but censors themselves for fear that conflict will erupt. A teacher fears that they may make mistakes, concerned about their lack of lived experience with the difficult issues they're tackling. A teacher wonders whether they're equipped to deal with their teacher's responses to discussions about violence and trauma, which might include personal disclosures in the classroom or someone seeking guidance with their own personal struggles. Or a teacher recently evaluated as being too controversial or political decides to take a safer path and move their teaching away from a topic they're passionate about. Let this manifesto guide you.
It's not okay for a white teacher to teach a class on racism in which all but a few of the required readings are written by white authors.
It's not okay to assume that someone who is not of a specific gender, class, ethnicity, or religion has little value to add to conversations that intersect with lived experience.
It's not okay to suggest that the suffering of one individual or group is less significant than another.
It's not okay for a curse to caricature various peoples and ignore the diversity of their experiences and perspectives.
It's not okay for a course to address rape culture to ignore the voices of survivors.
It is not okay to examine the impact of intergenerational trauma caused by settler colonialism without consideration of Indigenous resilience, resistance, and resurgence.
It's not okay for a teacher to use a historical text that has pedagogical value without warning the students in advance that it includes dehumanizing statements that seemed widely acceptable at the time.
It is not okay to refuse to use their pronoun or ask all students to disclose their pronouns publicly.
It's not okay for a teacher to ask any students to share their personal stories with the larger group to serve as a representative for their groups.
It is not okay to ignore the barriers that impact student learning in our classes.
It's not okay to ignore or silence the accomplishment of those historically marginalized.
What else is not okay? Please share in the chat if there are some things that this manifesto is provoking. We will come back to it.
Should I continue, Kim?
Sure.
Posters that said it's okay to be white were put up outside the office of one of the only Black faculty in my university's Women's Studies department. When the incident was brought up in a class by a fellow student, my white professor was appalled. She started asking the class to write a letter, to petition about it, to make a statement, to begin consciousness raising group talk so we could all discuss together the meaning of this poster. A student raised her hand, a white student, saying she couldn't understand how this could happen if we all love each other. As students of color were tuned out of the discussion. Why should we be the ones writing a statement and a petition demanding and explaining our humanity? I raised my hand and told the professor that as a woman of color, knowing about the posters on campus was literally just another Tuesday. I've dealt with much more serious hate speech on campus. I told her I was tired. How old are you? She responded, mocking my age and trying to get a laugh from the class, instead of facing the reality that for many people of color, age is irrelevant to our experiences of racism and discrimination, especially in school.
Dawson humanities teacher, member of our collective and founder of the Critical Pedagogy blog, Miriam Sambe, offers some needed perspective from Black students in her interview series, Tales in the Age of Black Lives Matter. Concordia student Malika Baba recounts one of her experiences in the education system. There is one instance in high school that bothered me when I was younger. This French kid who at school called me the N-word, and that made it worse, is that nobody around me reacted. Not other students, not teachers, nothing. I went to what you would consider a white school. So nobody understood why I was upset. In fact, the teacher even said, let's just calm down. And I told them that I would not calm down until he apologized. But that did not happen. It was frustrating because the teachers themselves were not saying anything to him. In the end, he wrote a letter apologizing for it, but that's just because I continued to show how angry I felt. Basically, I would not let it go. So they had him write a letter, but he didn't learn anything from it. Nobody sat him down to explain to him or to other students why this was wrong.
In an intro to immigration studies class, we were hearing a lecture about the specificity of the plight of asylum-seeking women and girls. We discussed the need for menstrual care, childcare, and pregnancy care while traveling. Then we mentioned sexual violence. The professor, without hesitation, told us that the greatest victim in these events was not the woman who survived the violence, but their husbands who had to carry on with the shame.
Intent doesn't matter until it does. The notion that a curriculum writer's or teacher's intention matters misses the point. Intentionality is not a prerequisite for harmful teaching. Intentionality is also not a prerequisite for racism. Stephanie Jones, Ending Curriculum Violence.
Without question, acts done out of habit or without conscious awareness can cause great harm, and intentions may make little difference to the suffering inflicted. As literary critic and psychoanalyst Jacqueline Rose notes, violence is essentially a crime of thoughtlessness.
Just recently, a Montreal South Shore School Board had to apologize for a French teacher's homework, which asked students to describe two gangsters who were both depicted as stereotypical Black characters. The assignment also included a reference to a crime scene where again the suspect was a person of color. The father of a biracial student complained and was told by the school's administration that the assignment had been used for the past 3 years without complaints, as he noticed nobody had noticed or were shocked.
Intention does not always matter. It doesn't let us off the hook. But at the same time, intent is not irrelevant. The clear presence of an intent to harm does intensify the harm being done. The knowledge that someone intends and even gains pleasure out of abusing you is psychologically devastating. The message it carries is clear. Your life and personhood are entirely irrelevant.
And our legal system does take intent into consideration because it is relevant to evaluating the very act, deciding on the punishment. So before we criticize, attack, demonize, or ignore, move on, and even forgive, we should certainly consider the intentions of the offender. And there are further complexities. Can we be certain of the other's claims that they did not intend to do harm? Perhaps there was indeed unconscious racism or sexism at play. And certainly, we are often not fully aware of our motives, something that applies both to the wrongdoer, but also to those demanding punishment. Vengeance, after all, can feel good.
We're also affected by what is known as attribution bias. Each of us is prone to believe that others perfectly understand our motives. If we do something bad, we assume that others recognize that we had no alternative. We are, after all, not bad people. But at the same time, we tend to assume the opposite about our opponent. It's not that the situation forced their hand or that they simply made a mistake. Rather, it's a confirmation of their inherent character. This phenomenon of attribution bias highlights the flexible ways we think about intent. Sometimes the possible lack of intent is deemed of little importance. The action and its consequences are all that really matter. Other times, particularly when we are the ones doing the act, our assumed lack of intent becomes everything.
Like artists, educators trying to provoke change will often take risks, seeking to disrupt established thought patterns. Can we find ways to provoke risk-giving offense while reducing the potential for harm? We should, though, keep in mind that the relative vulnerability in society of those affected matters greatly. There are people, and not necessarily the same people, who find each of these offensive. But are they doing harm? Do they reveal largely hidden systems of injustice? Are some making a valuable contribution? Is harm reduced when we present the controversy, recognizing that offense may be done to someone's experiences and deeply held worldview? In other words, show respect to the diversity of our students' experiences and cultural backgrounds? Are there any that cross the line between offense and harm?
In 2018, Harmonia Rosales, an Afro-Cuban artist based in Chicago, reimagined Michelangelo's classic work in provocative ways.
Images depicting the confinement, consumption, and mutilation of women's bodies remain all too common. What do we think of PETA's campaign depicting a white woman as cuts of meat?
And what do we make of the 2020 beheading of John A. Macdonald's statue in Montreal? Or, to further that, the subsequent stamps printed by Canada Post as part of its picture postage program that depicted the severed head. This was not intentional, by the way. This was done by someone. So we'd like to open this up to a larger discussion for those who would like to participate. We're bringing these up as kind of examples of something, something that we think in some instances could be causing harm, but we want to kind of make the distinguish between like, what is harm, what is offense, and what are the kinds of things that we absolutely want to bring into the classroom. There might be someone in the group here who would be, devastated to bring in Peda's ad or whatever it is, right? With the cutting up of a woman's body and all that kind of stuff. Whereas someone else might be, teaching a class on religion and perhaps having Harmonia Rosales's, famous painting reappropriated would be something difficult to bring up in that particular context. So we're just curious to know what are your thoughts with with the idea of offense versus harm. And do you think that any of these could be harmful to bring into the classroom?
Diane?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. But first, I just want a clarification. I didn't understand, Kim, that postage stamp of McDonald's. I haven't seen that. What?
So
Is that a joke? Or?
Well, kind of. I mean, it's not a joke at all, in the sense that, so there was the beheading of the statue.
Yeah,
and that took place. Someone took a photo and then took that photo, and there's this federal, you can make a postage stamp with your kid's face on it or your cat's face on it or whatever. And so they have this program where you can send in an image and then you can make your own postage stamp. And in this case, there was an activist who was thinking, oh, wouldn't it be great to use federal money to put the beheaded statue of John A. Macdonald on a postage stamp? And then it caused all kinds of, it made the news. People got freaked out. They had to put a stop to it, of course. And apparently this activist had ordered many and were handing them out and things like that. So the concept is kind of like a very interesting one, in the sense of like, I think when I just, as a side note, I do bring this example into the classroom because I actually think it's an interesting example of like what you can do with something fairly simple and use federal money to spread, information or at least provoke some kind of like questioning. If someone got that stamp, like, what is this?
Okay. Thanks. I don't know how I missed that. That's really interesting. So great. So thanks for letting me know. And I'm not surprised they shut it all down. And
just add to that, Diane, it was a federal employee.
Great. Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of a public relations Canada Post program, I think, essentially, to bring the Canada Post closer to Canadians. So, he knew about it, right? As most of us don't, and then subverted it, I think, really brilliantly.
Well, very interesting how people can do subversive actions. I find that very interesting. Okay, the point I was going to raise, this is very relevant to my work this semester. I teach a course. I've been teaching it for North-South Studies. I've been teaching for a long time, called Colonization and Decolonization. So looking at colonization, which is nasty and brings in, all sorts of nasty behavior on the part of Europeans all around the globe. And so, from both sides, it's interesting I've had students in the class who have been the anti-social justice warrior, anti-woke type, so challenging everything and being defensive. And we've even had some conferences at Dawson, how to deal with these sometimes even far right attitudes in the classroom, certainly right. But then there's the other side too, which I'm working on this semester, and how to be very sensitive to students in the class who like their histories are being portrayed, and the violence against these students, slavery, colonization of Africa, the Congo, the rubber terror, apartheid. It's always this over and over again, violence against this group of people. So it almost reinforces a stereotype that you're constantly talking about violence against the group. So how do you teach in a way to counter that, to acknowledge that, I always try to focus in the class really on the resistance. But of course, even there, you're resisting oppression, It would be nice to teach a course just on culture and music, but it's not what I teach. So it is, like you said, with difficult topics. So this semester, I wanted to bring to this group, seeing as this is really interesting I wasn't sure what you were going to talk about, but I got involved in the Concordia Anti-Racist Pedagogy Project. And I discussed it with my students and showed them a video that they had an excellent discussion on. But the whole point of that video was the images we use. And it's very relevant to teachers because now we all have PowerPoints. So we're constantly putting images on our PowerPoints. So you just raised this with some of those images. But of course, if you're talking about slavery or colonization in Africa, Asia, Iraq, or the Middle East, wherever it is, Americas, there's so many violent images. And this video was excellent, looking at the costs and the possibilities of violent images, you know, like Emmett Till, how his mother used that violent image consciously, the community wanted it used, whereas other images of lynching were used by whites to celebrate with postcards and this kind of thing. So how are images used? What do we use in the classroom? How will students perceive these images? It's very hard to find a film, for example, on King Leopold in the Congo, which isn't just too violent. You don't want to show the students any of them. So I've just been becoming much more conscious. I also give the students an assignment where they're choosing images to talk about their essays. So to sensitize them, you know, don't give me an assignment full of gory images, like really to reflect on which images can be politically helpful, can be part of the resistance, can be progressive, and which images could be harmful in their own, if we're giving them creative, you know, assignments to bring in images or music or whatever. So it's really interesting to me that you're doing this, and this is my experience. I'm dealing with this semester and really rethinking all my images and films that I use. And so great, thank you for raising this. Yeah.
Thank you, Diane.
It's very interesting, Diane, because I think there's so much that we're going to be talking about later on as well in the presentation. So you brought almost everything up that we want to touch upon. And then there's also this other thing that I think you're kind of hinting at that I think is really important, which is just you know, like Florencia has coined the term in our collective, like do the work, right? Like make sure that what you're sharing has significance, is possibly taking a risk but not causing harm, right? Like and knowing what that means. And it sounds like doing the work for you kind of resembled the anti-racist pedagogy at Concordia, and perhaps like doing all those other you know, reaching out to other sources and things like that. And I think those are really good examples. So
yeah, it's interesting though, because you really do start to feel, oh, maybe I just don't want to teach this anymore. You know, I think I'll just teach a course on music history or something. You know?
But you know what, Diane, because someone might say that too, like in my discipline, someone might say, oh, I just want to teach about musicals. But even those,
yeah, I know.
You know, like even music, like you can't, whenever something is cultural, there's you can't you know, I would say please don't, you know,
no,
like,
no,
don't
I
stop,
mean, I'm,
you know?
of course not. I'm
Yeah.
expressing that sometimes we do feel overwhelmed, you know.
Absolutely.
And that there's no real solution. We can do our best, but it's never perfect, you know. So you're always dealing with that. Well, okay, this is better, but it's not great. But anyway, we keep trying. Yeah, I think enough. I'll keep quiet.
Okay. Well, you know, we'll talk about the resistance angle too coming.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Elizabeth was next.
You just had to unmute. Thank you. One of the things that occurs to me, since I teach communications, I've been communications and public relations for more years than I would ever admit to. And I teach ethics and public relations and communications at McGill. So, and in addition to that, being at McGill, of course, we have very diverse class. So there's been a number of discussions that have come up, all very good because I've made sure to initiate. And one of the things that being a communicator that occurs to me is that awareness, well, it's always step number one. If you want to have a useful discussion on something, if you want to bring people together. And that in this case, in this kind of sensitive situations, awareness is a huge number one, because we need to kind of establish a general understanding of what rules we're playing with.
Mhm.
We need to know, for some people, when we're transgressing. They have a kind of innocent ignorance of the situation. They need to know much, much more about it. So, and also, we need to know when our reactions are appropriate to a transgression or perceived transgression. Our feelings are always appropriate. Nobody can tell you not to feel something, but the actions you take as a result affect other people. And because it's a back and forth action, everybody has some responsibility to affecting others and how they feel. People will throw accusations around the same way that people will throw insults around. And many other people don't seem to know what acknowledgement is appropriate and even what punishment is appropriate. Do you fire the teacher? Do you try and get inside their heads and judge them on their intentions? Is it a reprimand? Someone may not even know that there's a quote trigger word, and I am not using the word trigger in my classroom because recent research is showing that it triggers anxiety, just saying it. And this is confirmed by a friend of mine who's a PhD in ethics and specialist in racial discussions. But I do think, because she and I have a friend in common, taught in the States, taught our word coming up, rape law. And because she used the word rape in the classroom, in a class about rape, she was called out and she lost her job. And I feel okay in repeating this because I did hear it from a mutual friend of ours as well as news stories in the States. And that kind of thing echoes in the back of the heads of particularly of older teachers, which I'm one. And I've had a couple say to me that they're afraid of saying something that is going to unwittingly set off a chain reaction. And I haven't got it. I wish I had a solution for it. I don't, but it just clicked in the back of my head and set a bell ringing that said awareness, 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 and then dialogue. And there have been some good ones around on allyship and that sort of thing. But dialogue is important so that we understand what's right and what's wrong to do. There's very little jurisprudence on this kind of action.
I think you expressed it perfectly in terms of, the problem really that we're confronting and how complicated it is to navigate. And I think you express what's motivating us really with this creative collective is to really try to have those conversations in order to spread awareness, create that roadmap, encourage people to think seriously before, they choose a certain image to bring in the classroom, or they use a certain text, or they dive into a topic that's provocative, to realize that denial and psychological resistance is a reality that we all, it's part of human nature, and to sort of expect it and then think, okay, how am I going to confront that reality and find ways to open up rather than polarize the conversation. So thank you so much for the way you characterized it was perfect, I think.
Do we still have time, Pat and Kim, to take someone else? How are you doing? Or should we save for later? I know you have another space for discussion.
Can we save it for later? But I'm having trouble because it's like two of my favorite people who want to who want to talk, and I want to hear what everyone has to say. But I think if we want to get through it, that we probably should.
Selma and Florencia, I've got your names written down, so feel free to lower your hands, but you're on the list.
Thanks, Phoebe. Okay, so I will continue. Our teaching of systems of injustice must be centered on the harms done as told through the voices of those who've experienced them. Those of us complicit in the suffering of others, which in the interlocking systems of social and economic inequality likely mean all of us to some degree, need to be motivated to engage in self-reflection and make changes in our lives. We must therefore be convinced of the moral imperative to try. But our pedagogical efforts can be misguided and even negligent. In her 2014 article, Multiculturalism, Teaching Slavery and White Supremacy, Sadhana Berry offers us an extreme example of a curriculum failure on every level. There was a failure to consult with those likely to be most impacted, a failure to rethink the plan when people expressed opposition, and a failure to protect the students under their care. The project involved a reenactment of slavery in the form of a play written and staged by white teachers at a private New England primary school, apparently after some white students expressed an interest in experiencing being a slave. The performance went on despite the boycott of Black students and parents, with white students playing the roles they had chosen of slaves and rescuers, and the Asian and Latinx students playing the ones that remained, namely those of perpetrators.
When teachers ask students to learn about slavery by practicing being enslaved people or enslavers, students are not critically engaging with difficult histories. Stephanie Jones. In thinking about the pedagogical value of reenactments, education professor Stephanie Jones writes that they, quote, distort students' understanding of the past and present. They promote a sanitized version of slavery that isolates the system and its legacy within a bracket of time and with only a select few perpetrators and beneficiaries. We run the risk of situating slavery as a past event with no current connection, while also depriving students of its full social, historical, and economic context. And there's often no room to include stories of resistance, contribution, and triumph. We cannot speak for the victims. We should not seek to reappropriate the voices of those who have suffered and retell what literary and Black studies scholar Christina Sharp calls stories that cannot be told. Of course, we should create spaces for these voices to be heard, but these voices must be rich and never reduce people to the sole status of victim. Even if we mean well, our notion of victims is embedded with assumptions of powerlessness and passivity. And since no one wants to be a victim, our ability to empathize is limited. Thus, little is really being done to challenge the inequalities that make violence against long marginalized groups possible.
More than 10 years ago, Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck wrote an open letter to researchers and educators, calling on them to challenge the widespread tendency to examine Canada's colonial history from a damage-centered focus. Tuck argues that this focus looks to historical exploitation, domination, and colonization to explain contemporary brokenness, such as poverty, poor health, and low literacy. Common sense tells us this is a good thing, but the danger in damage-centered research is that it is a pathologizing approach in which the oppression singularly defines a community. Tuck calls for us to avoid the dichotomy of presenting oppressed people as either reproducing the hurt done to them or engaging in resistance. Avoiding either or thinking in this context is important because it more closely matches the experiences of people who, at different points in a single day, reproduce, resist, and are complicit in, rage against, celebrate, throw up hands, fists, towels, and withdraw and participate in uneven social structures. That is everybody.
So Trauma talk has apparently become very popular in our classrooms, and some versions of it have been referred to as trauma porn. I want to start out with a quotation. So, trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualized over time looks like family traits. Trauma in people decontextualized over time looks like culture. Resma Menikam. So how do we engage with this topic of trauma, and how do we distinguish between trauma porn and trauma-informed narratives? When reading literature with students that recounts traumatic events, I consider it valuable to engage directly with this notion of trauma. This semester, my classes are reading The Break by Katharina Vermette, a Métis author from Winnipeg. The story spirals around a case of sexual violence. As an educator going into the semester, I wondered what I could do beyond offering, this idea of the trigger warning. A colleague, Amelie Jackson, referred me to a very timely CBC article titled "The Case for the Trauma Plot: How Writers Can Use It with Purpose and Care" by Alicia Elliott. So this article engages with the topic of trauma and trauma porn with a direct discussion of Vermette's work. A key quotation from the article states, "Writers of trauma porn seem more interested in depicting all the blood and viscera of trauma than anything else. They don't seem to want their work to be in conversation with those who have actually experienced those traumas, nor do they feel any obligation toward them. Writers of trauma-informed narratives, on the other hand, seem to be deeply considering their audience, an audience they presume has gone through whatever traumas that author has chosen to depict, and that understands trauma is not an identity or source of status." I had students read the article and answer guiding questions about how and why we can consider Vermette's novel an example of a trauma-informed narrative. The exercise was well received, thankfully, and students actively commented on the importance of this distinction. So as a class, we continue to revisit this understanding as we progress through the book. One student noted that this distinction between trauma porn and trauma narrative or trauma-informed narratives helped to reframe her relationship with the book and with the idea of trauma in literature in general.
In their article, Potentially Perilous Pedagogies, Janice Carello and Lisa Butler present a picture of American undergraduate students that put them at high risk of experiencing trauma. They refer to research which suggests that by the time youth reach college, 66% to 85% report lifetime traumatic event exposure, and that up to 79% of college students may be exposed to at least one experience of psychological abuse, 31% to at least one incident of physical abuse, and 36% to at least one incident of sexual abuse in an intimate relationship. These statistics are shocking, and there is little to suggest that Canadian students are in a much better place. Mental health problems are on the rise in Canada as we tackle the multiple crises of our age: the pandemic, harmful social media, a worsening environmental crisis, rising alarms about the global economy, the war in Ukraine.
When does it end?
In response to this growing appreciation of our mental health crisis, discussions about trauma are appearing in classrooms across the disciplines, and some of them likely carry real risks of doing harm through re-traumatization or possibly unintentionally reinforcing harmful stereotypes of victimhood. There is indeed value in thoughtful classroom explorations of violence and trauma, but we should never require students to write about their own experiences unless they want to. At the same time, we should not assume that all victims of violence have been traumatized by their experiences. There are risks in seeing trauma everywhere.
Ask me how I resisted, not what was done to me. This brings us to Catherine Genoasco Richardson, who, along with a few colleagues, most particularly Linda Coates and Alan Wade, have developed a new approach to the work of violence prevention and repair. They call it response-based practice.
Alan Wade explains an important distinction between the focus of perpetrators and the survivors of violence. I meet regularly with people being told over and over and over and over and over again what's wrong with them, and who never had the opportunity to tell how they responded and resisted. He says, the perpetrator's history is the history of violence. The victim's history is the history of resistance. Alan Wade.
The position of response-based practice proponents is not that we should ignore the reality of trauma, but rather that we should not assume its presence in those who have experienced violence. To do so is to do further harm. A trauma-centered approach shifts our focus off the individual perpetrator or social system that has committed the harm. It ignores the social context of violence, and in so doing, once again, dilutes questions of social responsibility. When supported by positive human relationships, people tend to get back on their feet and retain their dignity and sense of self-worth, even after horrific experiences. And most problematically, an emphasis on trauma can pathologize the victim, remove their agency, and ignore the ways in which they sought to resist and protect their dignity.
Richardson's critique is built on many years of being a counselor and applying an approach that uses response-based practice, a practice informed by feminism, social justice, and human rights. This approach expands our conception of resistance, encouraging us to think beyond the political to the psychological dimensions of resistance, and to think of it not solely in big, bold, and often aggressive moves, but also in subtle, personal ones that may not even be recognized by the victims themselves, who are often consumed years after the events by the thought, if only I'd fought back more. It challenges a dominant perspective encouraged by mental health professionals, police officers, and legal services, including apparently many educators, to ask those harmed to talk about what was done to them. Quoting Alan Wade, when people are treated badly, they always resist in some way. Any mental or behavioral act through which a person attempts to expose, withstand, repel, stop, prevent, abstain from, strive against, impede, refuse to comply with, or oppose any form of violence or oppression, including any type of disrespect, or the conditions that make such acts possible, may be understood as a form of resistance.
In response-based practices, the work is to recognize that the responses to violence are essentially forms of resistance. When we can focus on responses to violence without victim blaming, we find a victim's effort to maintain a place of dignity. This could come in the form of getting a ride home from a perpetrator when they have just been abused by them, or hiding in a place they know they can't be found. These are the forms of resistance that go unnoticed, or are either ignored by the law or are often misunderstood. Richardson and her colleagues are calling for us to make sure this part of the story is not ignored. In the performance of Eve Ensler's Crooked Braid by Tantu Cardinal, there is a humorous way in which resistance is practiced. The story is painful, but the retaliation is sweet. Based on the interviews compiled for the Vagina Monologues, this video seems to illustrate perfectly what resistance can look like in the face of violence. We'd like to share it with you now.
After 18 years, he beat me. In the morning, when he was so nice again, I would braid his long hair. I would take my time like I cared so much, and I would do it perfectly crooked. I would make the hairs so they would stand up all crazy like. He'd walk all cocky in the street, all macho in the road, but his braid would be so crooked and look so stupid and wrong. This shouldn't have made me that happy, you know? My husband beat the shit out of me. He wrapped my long black hair around his hand, jerked my head. I tried to get my son. That's not your son, he said, holding my hair in his hand. That's not your son anymore. Now he calls me in the middle of the night, weeping. He didn't mean to beat his wife. He didn't mean to batter her. He's suicidal. He knows what his mother went through. But he can't stop my son. They took our land. They took our ways. They took our men. We want them back.
Just going to take a moment to breathe through that one. I think it's a very strong piece. So one of the things that we're contemplating now,
want them back.
Oh, sorry. One of the things that we're contemplating a lot now in the Creative Collective for Change is this concept of how we view resistance, and it seemed like a mind shift for us, I think, as we were kind of looking at some of these things in terms of, you know, this response-based stuff. What I find interesting in this particular example that we just shared with you is, yeah, the crooked braid is resistance. You know, it's a form. I think that kind of comes through. But I would also say that the phone call to his mom, right, to say, I don't know what to do. I'm beating my wife too, right? All of these things become kind of moments of like reflecting on what is really resistance, right? What did you do in the face of the abuse that was given to you? And I think there's so many layers there. Mm-hmm. And just to kind of say out loud, I want them back. I want my men back. I want my land. I want what, you know, I want my dignity back, in a sense. And so I think as we start contemplating these ideas around, you know, if resistance can be how we are responding to things, then I think there's a lot we're resisting to and we don't even know it. And I think reflecting on that in the classroom can be a very, very, very powerful thing as we continue through the ideas of addressing violences. I see there's a lot of people who've written some stuff in the chat, so I'll let Phoebe kind of take over here, but we would like to have a bit of a discussion around this idea.
I'll just add to what Kim said. Catherine Richardson, we weren't doing very well with identifying all of our authors, but so Catherine Richardson is, she's one of the co-creators of response-based practice, but she is currently the director of the First Peoples Studies program at Concordia University. So we kind of just through a colleague learned about her potentially having some interesting insights on how to deal with this issue of the potentially traumatizing your students or having students in our classrooms who were at grave risk of being traumatized or had been traumatized, right? And so we started to explore her work. And as Kim said, when we discovered this idea that, you know, resistance can also be understood in these very subtle ways. it really broadened and expanded our view. And I think we're just kind of beginning to delve into it, but thinking that it has enormous potential power for our pedagogy. So I'll turn it over to Phoebe as well.
Okay, and I'm just here to turn it over to you. So I have Selma and Florencia on the list. Selma, does this fit in okay with where you were?
Yes. Perfect. Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, everyone. I think this is such an important topic that needed to be addressed, that needs to be addressed, that needs to be talked about at this in our pedagogical context. These are important conversations to be had. There's an inescapability of like the who is sitting in our classroom. I've said this before, and I can't remember who said this, but anyway, it's not mine. But somebody once said, we're not teaching content, we're teaching students. So we need to know who these students are, who's in front of us, and how to address them. As a teacher, and I teach psychology, so I've addressed like difficult topics. I mean, it's easily feasible in my context, in my classroom in this discipline, but I'm not sure that we as educators are prepared or well equipped for this. And this is why I appreciate this webinar and what you're doing, what the collective is doing, and what Saltese is supporting it through all of this, to give us the tools to prepare us for these kinds of conversations. And it's not just the responsibility of the teacher to learn about these things. I think that institutions have to be on board with this, and I think many institutions are, to some degree, but still I think there's an operational process that needs to happen at some point. When you're hired as a new teacher, you're focusing on content and just getting your delivery ready, but how do you deliver? What are you delivering? And as teachers, we sometimes perpetuate what we've seen before, right? What we've experienced. So if our textbooks are Eurocentric, Anglo-Saxony, we're just running with this and not necessarily thinking about how am I presenting this content to my students? What are we really delivering out here? And so I just want to stress that it's the responsibility of teachers and institutions. And I'm happy to have heard that about like la commission scientifique, I have it here, et technique indépendante sur la reconnaissance de la liberté académique. That's a mouthful. But it was a commission that happened, I want to say almost a year ago. No, I don't know. Maybe
2021, I think. It was 2021.
Yeah. And it was in response to I think what Elizabeth was mentioning before, this precarity of teachers when they're addressing sensitive topics, and how our jobs, our livelihoods are at stake in some cases. And I think it was such an important problematic issue that even the government, well, les commissions se sont mis to talk about it, but I don't know how much of that work of la commission has actually kind of découlé, I don't know what the word is, but trickled down to our classrooms. But it's clear that at many palates we're recognizing that it's important to know how to address these issues, that we are in our classrooms have to offer safe spaces for students, but also for teachers, and institutions have to support all of this. And how are they doing that? It's still, I feel like it's still in the beginnings of it, and I don't have anything other to say than thank you for doing this, and I hope it does continue. And I appreciate that your focus is like the the conversations with the teachers, with the students. I wish there was like some I don't know if there are administrators in this Zoom room that could be hearing this and kind of getting on board from that at that level. That's all.
Thanks, Selma.
Florencia?
Yeah, sure. Mine were a bit more points on the past discussion, but just like to tie it to this discussion. Well, I graduated from women's studies. So all of the classes, we always talk about sensitive issues. We always talk about like woke issues. We always talk about this kind of issues. First, I like the concept of safer spaces instead of safe spaces. Safer spaces, we cannot promise that the classroom will always be a safe space, but we can try to make it safer, right? Something that usually we use in our classrooms is making a class constitution at the beginning of the class. And so it's basically like what will fly, what won't fly. And that's when professors can express their anxieties as well about like, we will be discussing rape culture. And so I will be using these words. Like, if you need to take care of yourself, please let me know, or like, please do so and take responsibility also as a student, because I think all of you are teaching college level. So like, as adults, take responsibility of your person and also excuse yourself if you need to, right? And so this kind of like conversations and treating students as people, as adults, and creating this kind of like constitution, if you may, has worked very well. This is just like in my department, right? But again, everyone has different departments, and I don't know what applies in other departments. For the good intentions conversation that we were having before, and I don't know why I hadn't mentioned this stories, Pat and Kim, in our meetings. I just remember them, but one of them, it was like a great class, and we had a guest speaker who was doing like this workshop on like, basically it was a workshop meant for like Canadian students who go abroad, and it was meant to be like challenging power dynamics, but it didn't at all. It reproduced like all of the power dynamics, and it ended up being like a white savior approach to this like kind of voluntarism kind of experiences. And basically the people who were giving the workshop hadn't updated their workshop in at least a decade, I can say. And they admitted that, right? And so the workshop was meant for white Canadian students, and at least 50% of the class was not white and was not Canadian. And so they made us enact this scenarios where you're traveling to Iraq, you're traveling to Mexico, you're traveling to whatever, like there were different. And so in one, you were imprisoned alongside Iraqi, like news, like, you know, like journalists. And another one, it was like, you suffered, like you were a crime victim in like Mexico and stuff like this. And this is our countries, right? And so it was basically like, what do? Do you stay in prison with your like fellow like journalists, or do you like ask the Canadian embassy to like, you know, like save you? And so in the group discussion, I was like, well, I'm not a Canadian citizen and I'm not white, so I will not choose to like go to prison, you know? And they were like, just pretend. Like, instead of like taking a second to analyze that, yeah, of course, they were making me imagine some scenario that I cannot even put myself in. And of course, I'm not going to like, just like, yeah, I go to prison. Like, this doesn't work for me. Instead of that, they were asking me to aspire to whiteness again, to put myself in a position of whiteness and being like, oh yeah, as a Canadian citizen, like that doesn't work. So yeah, it was a good intention, I guess, for like Canadian citizens to analyze their privilege, but at the same time, it didn't work out at the end of the day, because it was again vis-a-vis reproducing the power dynamics that we experience every single day, right? And the last one, it was, I don't remember who was mentioning that they like are teaching communications, I guess, and like the movies that they put in and all of this. So I studied like my elementary up to college was in Mexico. And in our like Riviera Maya history class, they would show us the movie Apocalipto by Mel Gibson to show us what the Mayans were like. And like, this is like literally like us, right? And we would be watching like Apocalypse, like it was just, so yeah. These are things that happen all the time. And as Kim said, I always say like, do the work. And so that's basically it, like doing the research, doing the background work, because yeah, you may be anxious about bringing it up in the classroom, but if you actually do the work, like it won't be that bad, I swear.
Thanks, Florencia. Janet.
So Liz Charles and I were having a little conversation in the background about the learning sciences that I just made me think about all the different things that we do in that, the assumptions that we make were the ones that and that we fail to see, and how they occur, you know, with great regularity outside of the humanities. For example, in science, what's the science that we deem important, right? It tends to be science that is military related, medical related, making money related, and you know, so much of the science research that is funded in this country is funded by the Defense Department. You're not my country, I'm in the US, is funded by the Defense Department. And I just there are values that we carry around with us every day, right? We're making these cultural values that have to do with different cultures of origin, right? Very clear, and, you know, grappling with them. But there's all this cultural stuff having to do with the values that we live with every day that that we don't even recognize are such influence so much, right? What it is, the way that we organize education overall, and what we expect of people. I'm just started thinking about it, so I don't really know more than to say just that.
That's lovely. Thank you for sharing. I don't know how to respond to all of this right now, but I think, you know, to start with what Selma said, I think I think administrations and institutions are fumbling through all of this, because I think we all are kind of fumbling through. But as Florencia said, there are ways to do the work and make it happen. And then, you know, to come back to what Janet was saying, you know, maybe there's something in the last phase of what we have to say that will help. We talk about fostering a critical hope, and perhaps that's something that could be useful in relation to some of the frustrations that I think we see and we feel on an everyday basis, like you're speaking of. That's just my thought. I don't know, but maybe we should continue, because I see that there isn't that much time, and we do want to get to that critical hope part, because it's actually the inspiring part. We're not even there yet at the inspiring part. So
Hopefully inspiring part.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, everyone. And I see in the chat too, a lot going on related to the sciences and legitimacy of knowledge. And this is incredible. Thanks.
Hopefully we can bring all these back at the end if we have some time.
Yeah.
So these are the type of voices that expand our understanding of the world, and at the same time may also provide unexpected support to those in our classes struggling to come to terms with their own experience. They return agency and self-worth to people who have been asked over and over by often sympathetic listeners to speak about what was done to them. They remind us of the necessity of drawing out the ways that people, even in the worst circumstances, do things to uphold their dignity. Victim blaming has no space in our classrooms, and recognizing that we can tell stories from the unexpected ways in which people have, can, and do risk might even inspire a more heroic vision of everyday actions against harm.
How can we address issues that divide us along continuums of complicity and harm in ways that can draw out deeper connections? In the resist violence pedagogy, we often turn to art, stories, photographs, poems, music, and other artwork can evoke our emotions and help us reflect in a profound way. The complexities, tensions, and nuances inherent in many works of art appeal to our intellect, our emotions, and perceptions. In other words, art generates affect. As Stephen Duncombe and Steve Lambert from the Center for Artistic Activism write in their article titled, "Why Artistic Activism? 9 Reasons." Artistic activism, on the other hand, is a practice aimed at generating emotionally resonant experiences that lead to measurable shifts in power, experiences that have an effect on the world. Artistic activism brings affect and effect together. Quote, "The goal is not to force compliance, which art can never do, but to persuade by creating moving experiences that prompt people to question the world as it is, imagine a world as it could be, and join together to make that new world real." That's from the Center for Artistic Activism.
Art can connect people. We know from a 2004 RAND study that, quote, "The communicative nature of the arts, the personal nature of creative expression, and the trust associated with revealing one's creativity to others may make joint arts activities particularly conducive to forging social bonds and bridges across social divides." It's from McCarthy et al. There's strength in creating that thing, and even more in learning how to express one's truth in a space where others are taking the same risk. By engaging in this activity collectively, we not only explore agency, creativity, vision, and vulnerability as a team, admitting when things are not where we might want them to be.
A young man in my class had an idea for a project on objectification. It was a commentary on the over-sexualization and commodification of women in rap music and culture. On the day of the pitch to the class, he waited until the very, very end to speak. He presented the idea of reappropriating album covers, replacing the revealing images of women with that of men to make a point. Then sheepishly he said, "I kind of feel bad presenting this idea because I'm white and I'm a guy, you know?"
What? No!
Erupted a voice in the back of the class. It was the voice of a Black female student.
It can't just be me. We all have to fight this together. Kim's student echoes the concern that many teachers have when thinking about tackling complex issues in which they have no direct life experience. As noted, we should not speak for those who have been harmed, or we end up silencing them yet again. And we must avoid suggesting comparisons about who has suffered more. I still remember today my rising anxiety when one of my white male students early on in the semester, after we'd collectively read several texts examining cruelty in different contexts, said, "I get this, class. It's about who has suffered more." His question was posed in a challenging fashion. I sensed it needed to be rebutted convincingly, but I only understood its full significance weeks later when he opened up to me about his personal struggles with foster care and poverty. As we focus on specific forms of violence, we must not forget others.
We need to stop playing privilege or oppression Olympics because we'll never get anywhere until we find more effective ways of talking through difference. We should be able to say, "This is my truth," and have that truth stand without 100 clamoring voices shouting, giving the impression that multiple truths cannot coexist.
Important connections can be drawn when we examine different systems of violence to draw out similar historical roots or the societal processes that lead to violent responses. Insights can be gained through examining the relationships between different forms of violence. The poem Crooked Brain links the domestic violence faced by Indigenous women in their intimate relationships with the loss of Indigenous lands, the violence of colonialism. Another example is the growing recognition that many mass shooters have a previous history of domestic violence. Of course, this discovery surprises few feminists who have linked violence against women to numerous other forms of violence inflicted on both humans and nature.
We can think of the call from renowned political activist Angela Davis, who emphasizes the need to keep in mind the intersectionalities between struggles at home and those abroad. She recalls, quote, I remember growing up in the most segregated city in the country, Birmingham, Alabama, and learning about South Africa because Birmingham was known as the Johannesburg of the South, quote unquote. She points out that resistance movements learn from the successes and failures of other movements, mentioning the phenomenon of young Palestinian organizing Freedom Rides recapitulates the Freedom Rides of the 1960s by boarding segregated buses in occupied territories of Palestine, and then being arrested as the Black and white Freedom Riders were in the 60s. We can analyze the strategy of nonviolent movements, keeping in mind the power of creative and committed nonviolent activists to inspire us, awe us, and challenge us to do more or change our behavior in some significant ways. We can also delve into nonviolent theory and its perspective on how meaningful social change takes place.
In her essay on Revolution and Equilibrium, published in 1968 in the magazine Liberation, Barbara Deming, the white daughter of a corporate lawyer, but also feminist, lesbian, writer, poet, and nonviolent activist, challenged the West Indian psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon, who argued that violence was needed to free the oppressed from the psychological prison of colonialism, as well as the Black Power activists criticizing Martin Luther King's complete commitment to nonviolence. She wrote, I won't try to pretend that progress has been made that has not been made, but I think one has to ask certain questions. Have gains been slight because nonviolent tactics were the wrong tactics to employ? Or did many of those leading the battle underestimate the difficulties of the terrain before them? Did they lack at the start a sufficiently radical vision? Can those who have now turned from reliance upon nonviolence say surely that resort to violence over those same years would have brought greater gains? She goes on. Too often in the past, nonviolence has confined itself to petition, but there's no need for it to do so, especially now that so many have learned change is harder to get than they had imagined. There have always been those in the nonviolent movement who called for radical action. To resort to power, one need not be violent, and to speak to conscience, one need not be weak, not be meek. The most effective action both resorts to power and engages conscience. Deming was fearless, even going so far in an unexpected meeting in 1960 with Fidel Castro while she was visiting Cuba to ask him whether it was really necessary for the revolution to kill its opponents. But she also recognized she had to do the work first, to listen to those who had been affected the most by the power she was resisting, an important lesson for all of us to keep in mind.
Rather than ask students to immerse themselves in the worst of humanity, we need to create more spaces for the best. Stories of resistance, contribution, and triumph, along with others that reveal the actions of those seeking to break their complicity with a historic wrong. Our role is not, as Zimbalist argues, to get our students to admit their complicity, but inspire them to take action that makes a difference. Megan Bowler agrees, noting that education is not effective if it is combative and alienating, adding that as educators, we shatter someone's familiar and comfortable worldview in compassion, we need to replace the vacuum with something else. She goes further, suggesting that we need to offer our students a sense of quote unquote critical hope. She quotes one of her angry defensive white male students who told her at the end of the semester that he wished she had told the class that all these things, all these screwed up things in the world could possibly change. We end with a few,
Go ahead.
we end with a few public art projects that sought to do just that. They provoke, forcing us to question and ultimately think about what we would have done and could do now.
Berlin's Schönberg Memorial, conceived by artist Renata Stee and architect Frieder Schnock, is a memorial in one of the city's beautiful central squares. It seeks not only to commemorate the deportation and murder of Berlin's Jewish citizens, but also remind everyone how it all began. The art project consists of 80 colorful signs affixed to lampposts that identify the laws, horrifically specific, which gradually excluded Jews from meaningful participation in civic life. It began with the seemingly innocuous 1934 law, quote, Jews cannot become actors, giving way to a stream of harsher laws, quote, Jews are not permitted to own radios. The final sign is undated and without written text, simply an image with 3 gas canisters. As theologian Donald Shriver writes, this one may be the hardest for parents and grandparents to explain to the children, but daily explanations are called for as one walks through the neighborhood. Indeed, Stier and Schnock began their installation by simply affixing signs, provoking citizens to protest to the police that neo-Nazis had invaded the neighborhood. The 2 young artists responded with the observation that when these laws were first introduced in the 1930s, no citizen called the police or otherwise publicly protested.
Classic mute problem. Another public art project is the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial, dedicated in 2003 in downtown Duluth, Minnesota. The memorial recalls the June 1920 murders of 3 African-American men who had been falsely accused of sexually assaulting a local white woman. That evening in 1920, a mob of 10,000 people, about 1/10 of the city's population, attacked the jail where 6 suspects were being held, grabbed 3 of the prisoners and lynched them from the crook of an electric light pole. Erica Doss calls the memorial a compelling example of restorative justice in contemporary public art. It stands directly across the street from the site of the lynching, along with quotes from Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Elie Wiesel, and many others. The memorial emphasizes one quote from British philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke. An event has happened upon which it is difficult to speak and impossible to remain silent. The sidewalks are embedded with the words respect, compassion, and atonement. Doss notes that the memorial seeks to rewrite memory and history in ways that both victims and their perpetrators can share. This call to refuse historical amnesia and embrace both individual and collective responsibility was powerfully voiced in a speech of apology given by Warren Reed the day of the lynching memorial's dedication. Reed, a teacher living more than 1,600 miles away in Washington state, felt compelled to attend the dedication of the lynching memorial. He had been researching his family's genealogy and was horrified to discover that his great-grandfather had helped lead Duluth's lynch mob. With his voice choking with emotion, Reed apologized to Clayton, Jackson, and McGee, and observed, "True shame is not the discovery of a terrible event such as this, but in the refusal to acknowledge and learn from that event." He added, "I stand here as a representative of my great-grandfather's legacy, and I willingly place that responsibility upon my shoulders."
Public art is not just for artists and art students. It is for anyone seeking a source of critical hope. Stephen Duncombe and Steve Lambert define artistic activism as a practice aimed at generating emotionally resonant experiences that lead to measurable shifts in power. Intellectually, I was interested in artistic activism. I believe that making space for art in my classroom would energize students, create new entry points into the course material, and offer students a sense of critical hope. This intellectual belief did not make me any less nervous, however. On the day I showed up to my sociology class with Bristol board, scissors, markers, and my kids' acrylic paints. I don't consider myself an artist, and neither do most of the students in my social science courses. I don't know why students responded so well to my invitation to create an art installation for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Maybe making art outside in the sun was a welcome break from sitting through lectures. Maybe they were genuinely curious to learn how much progress had been made in implementing the TRC's 94 calls to action. Maybe they had been looking for ways to act in solidarity with residential school survivors and were excited to have this opportunity. Or maybe, like me, they were using the approach of fake it till you make it. Here's what I do know. Our team of non-artists managed to create 94 Bristol board t-shirts, one for each of the TRC's calls to action. We hung them up and down the first floor hallways, and we sparked conversations. Students and staff commented on how surprised they were that so few calls to action had been completed. The day after we made art together, I asked students what they thought of our unconventional class the day before. One of the Indigenous students in class raised her hand. It was the first time all semester she had raised her hand to share something in front of the whole class. She said,
I feel proud. We did something important.
We are
Responsible for the world.
in which we find ourselves.
If only because we
Are the only sentient force
that can change it.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for Saltese for inviting us. It's been a true honor to meet everyone and to have these conversations. And we want to continue having them. So please, please, please join our creative collective if you're interested. We are doing things like this, but we're also doing workshops where alumni are kind of showing examples of how they use collage, how they use, how they've integrated artworks into their everyday practice, or they've done stuff within the classroom that is meaningful and they want to share that with you. We don't have a website that is launched yet, but it will be very soon. So if you would like to know more about it, you can always contact myself, Kim Simard or ksimard at dawsoncollege.qc.ca, and Pat Romano, the same P Romano at dawsoncollege.ca. And we also have resources and blog posts and all kinds of interesting examples of what students have done in classes at the Resist Violence website, so www.resist-violence.com. So please feel free to connect with us there as well. And I will leave it to Phoebe to speak further.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Pat. Thank you to the entire team. That was, as I had mentioned at the beginning, a very, very interesting. Not just what you were saying, but also the shape of how you said it and the message that came through from it. It's so interesting to see it in action. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
Thanks so much, Phoebe.